Hello, I'm Daedalus with Nerds and Stuff, and today I'll be turning this into this. Let's get started. So today I'm going to start just by putting down a base color of flesh tone. I want to get that down first, kind of painting from the inside out, so to speak, so that I don't have to try and paint those hard layers later on, when I get a lot of paint on. Not being super careful, just kind of trying to get the paint out. Prime this miniature white because a lot of the paints I'd be using would be paints that don't typically cover very well over darker pigments. So like this light flesh tone does not go well over black at all. So now I'm moving on to painting the eyes, using my signature eye painting technique. And while I wait for the black to dry, I kind of just jump right into using this time to paint some brown, kind of get his hair going while I wait for that paint to dry. I didn't want this tutorial to be extremely long, so I just kind of wanted to use my time to the best of my ability. So I'm just going to make sure I've got an even coat on the top before switching back over to the little brush to work on the eyes again. Now I'm just going to lay down a little bit of white for the eyeball. I really like this eye technique. I use it on pretty much any miniature that doesn't have a glowing eye. I find it just makes the eyes really kind of pop out, especially at tabletop distance. So I'm just going back to do another coat on the hair while I wait for the eyeball white to dry. Kind of used a real thin brown, so I wanted to make sure I had good coverage all the way throughout. Now that the white's dry, I'm actually cheating and using a 0.05mm micron marker to kind of base my pupils. Didn't really like how it looked, so I decided I'd go back and kind of touch up the pupils a little bit. It looked kind of too small, I'd say. I apologize for some of these weird angles, but I can't really paint in a vise, so I just have to kind of make do with what I've got. The old shaky hands claw grips. Still continuing with that eye technique, just cleaning up now. Making little minor mistakes, but we're all human, right? Since I do use kind of thinner paints, a lot of the time I do have to do multiple coats. I do prefer the thinner paints though. I feel like you have a lot better control when working on fine details. I do try and keep them thin when I can, unless I need to absolutely get a full coverage, and then I usually still work with just very little amounts on the brush. Because it's a whole lot easier to go back and forth from the palette a lot than to just have to clean up a bunch of mistakes later. And that's something that is just learned by experience. So take my advice and don't get that experience yourself. Save yourself some time. Now I'm just kind of touching up some of the flesh, making sure I've got even coverage and kind of a full sound looking coat before moving on. Continuing with that in to out method, now I'm going to be getting some red on my palette so that I can do kind of the undershirt here. So I just kind of want to splash this down in. It's such a small layer because there's so much stuff on this model's chest that I just wanted to get it done and out of the way. Not being too careful, because I know I'm going to be careful later with the stuff on top because it'll be really hard to get this brush back in to touch up the reds if I make a mistake, like I just did, painting his chin red. That'll take a couple of coats to cover up. But hey, you know what they say about painting? 80% of the time, you're just covering up your mistakes. Now I'm going to start on the pants, because they're kind of the next lowest layer. Kind of get a nice brown out, and this brown's going to take a couple of coats, because it's one of those browns that doesn't cover super well. I don't know if the pigments are thin or what. I like the color, but it takes 2 or 3 coats over white to really show up, which could just be because I'm painting on white, as opposed to painting it on a dark tone like a black. I find that I still have that same issue whenever I use this paint. But honestly, yeah, I'm not too worried. Multiple coats isn't a big deal. Make sure I get nice even coverage, solid pigment built up. Makes the models look better in the end. Still not being super careful because I still have a lot of, we'll say, unpainted space on the model. So I can afford to make these little mistakes here for the sake of time. Now I am taking the same brown I did for the pants, and I will actually be building this color up to white on kind of the trim here. I like to build my whites from either brown or blue, depending on whether I want a warmer white or a colder white. I chose a warmer white here because of the rest of the colors in the palette. It seemed like it would look better. A colder white would have looked out of place. This is probably an unnecessary step at this point, because I could just come back later and go over the green of the coat. I figured it would be good practice, and it would help me build up a good tone and kind of make sure I didn't have to build a super brown tone up before moving on. So now I'm painting his eyebrows. I always seem to forget to paint eyebrows on models until I'm about to finish them. Just touching up a spot on his, that red spot on his chin. And now we're starting on the coat. So I've got a nice dark green here. It's a green, like many, that requires multiple coats, because it's kind of thinner. But I really like the color it puts down. So I'm willing to do multiple coats for it, because this is actually one of my favorite greens I've got in my collection. I don't often use it because I don't paint anything that dark, but I really like it. So just taking my time. There's going to be a fair number of coats to get this green built up where I want it, especially over white. I find if I put this one over a blue, it actually makes for a really nice color and doesn't require many coats of covering, and blue usually covers really well. I don't know if it's just pigment concentration or just the color science, but whenever I put blue down on something, it seems like I rarely need more than 2 coats, where I think this green might be 3 or 4 to really get it where I want it. And all this could just be my paints. I mean, the most common phrase in painting is your mileage may vary. And honestly, it's true. One bottle of paint from the same company will be a lot different from the next. Not like by malicious intent, but just pigment concentrations are different, the colors are different. I've even had the same paint multiple times come with different pigment concentrations, and some were thinner and others needed to be thinned. And, you know, I don't credit that as a fault of the manufacturer by any means. It's just kind of the nature of the industry. And I'm not too worried about it. I can doctor my own paints. Just getting the underside of the coat just in case anybody happens to flip him over. They'll still see that green, just like on the inside of the jacket. And we have coat number 3. All your colors today were selected by my good friend Sterling, who actually, this miniature will be his for that Star Wars campaign we're playing in. This is Remy Novus, our Corellian pilot. So finally I'm going to hit some of the black parts. My black is really thick. It's just one of those things where this particular bottle I got happens to run a little on the thick side. I normally don't put it on that thick, but with black, I don't know, you don't really have to worry. It's not like you need the pigment to build up, or I don't know. It's kind of just such an absolute color that it just is. So I'm not only going to hit the parts that are going to be black, but I'm also going to paint all of my metallic parts black. I find that when most metallics... Okay, so we've got 2 different classifications of metallics. You've got your silvers and your golds. Your golds typically look best with a brown base coat. It brings out kind of more of the, we'll say, the yellow in the gold, as opposed to a black base coat where it will just kind of look streaky, almost. It's like the pigment in the golds aren't quite strong enough to build up the full color, whereas most of your silvers typically are. So I always put my golds on kind of a brown base, and any of my silvers I will do on black, because I just think it makes it look colder, it makes it look grittier and darker before even adding in a wash. And kind of the in-betweens, the brasses, it depends. Sometimes it's a brown, sometimes I'll do black. I guess if I'm going for more of a cold or warm look, that's what will kind of set it for me. Or I guess whatever's on my palette. Just getting the parts of his, like, buckle zipper. There's a lot going on this miniature, especially on that chest piece. His front is just so active. You know, this is a really good sculpt, actually, from Fantasy Flight. Normally, with a lot of these types of models, they'll have your base bits, and then you've got to kind of pick out your details. This one, they're all really clean, really well shown. Honestly, it made painting it really easy, because I don't have to do any extra work. I just kind of, you know, paint by numbers, so to speak. I always appreciate a nice, clean sculpt. Every once in a while you get some that just, you know, you look under their arm or something and it's just kind of a blob going into the armpit, and that's not much fun, but, you know, I don't blame these sculptors, especially these commercial guys where they don't get paid super well, or girls. A lot of lady sculptors out there too. And they just have to try and... They don't get paid by the hour, they get paid by the sculpt. So yeah, not many people are going to look into an armpit on a model and be like, oh, that's some great detail we've got in that there armpit. But when you paint, you tend to appreciate things like that. You appreciate the effort from the sculptor. So now I'm just finishing up painting his gloves. He's got these kind of driving gloves on. Makes kind of a fun cloth transition from the driving gloves to like his shirt cuff, which is a very wide cuff, to like the rest of his shirt and his coat. I guess it's not a shirt cuff, it's his coat cuff. So now I'm just touching up some of these green areas. I was a little careless with the black. I loaded my brush up a bit more than I should have, trying to go quickly. So now I've got to add in a little bit of time while I go and touch up these little spots. You know, an interesting thing about this sculpt, and every time I look at it, this model's face, he looks like a Vulcan. I have no better way to describe it than that. Just like from Star Trek, you know? He's got that broad jaw, very well defined. He's got a very forward, strong brow with a very sharp pointed nose and kind of a very angular face. The guy looks like a Vulcan without pointy ears. Vulcan. What's a Vulcan doing in the Imperial Assault game? So now I'm just touching up the browns, because same problem. I was rushing. Oh yes, I was having some issues with my blue tack. Kept coming loose. Finally had enough. I figured I'd swap it out for some new blue tack. It's so cheap. I don't know why I try and stretch it as long as I do. You know how it is, when mini painting, every dollar counts, every few cents. So just touching up some of these browns, so that when I do go and paint the white, I still have that base layer to go from. Just want it to look nice and even, because painting white is just a pain. Using some ultra fine brushes here. That one I'm using right now is actually a 18-0. The one I usually use that's got the longer bristles is a 10-0. I kind of prefer the smaller brushes. I have shaky hands, so they allow me to have a little bit better control. Doing another round of touch-ups, any places I might have missed before, still kind of building that color up. Hitting any of those spots I accidentally dragged the brush onto with brown. Touching up black now, same reasons. Hitting a couple of spots, like on the boot, I missed his under heel actually. Missed some stuff on his gloves and dragged the brown a little bit on his knee pads. Now I'm hitting some of his leather with just a leather brown. He's got a lot of leather pieces, like a little confused by this one. It's almost like it was supposed to be a holster, and then they forgot to put the holster part. So he's just kind of got this leather strap coming down across his thigh. And I don't know, maybe the holster's tucked up under his coat, but it's just kind of a weird little piece of leather. Lots of stuff going on his chest, though. He's got a very busy shirt, that red. Lots of this like leather bandolier piece. He's got a piece of plate armor on his chest that I missed with the black highlights, and I'll actually get later once I realize it, which might be right now. No, now I'm touching up the red. Remember how I said I didn't want to do that? Yeah, I got careless. Trying to be quick. Now I'm hitting that metal, because I realized what it was. As well as the edges on his goggles. Sure hope they're goggles. I don't know what else they'd be up around his neck like that. Then I just decided I'd do that whole stretch black leather on top instead of the rest of the leather, so that the goggles look like a separate piece. Just touching up a few of the black spots so that when the metallics go on, it'll look really nice. Now right now I do believe I'm mixing up a kind of an electrum color. I took my brightest silver and my brightest gold, and I mixed them together with about 1 part silver to 2 parts gold, since the gold I've got doesn't quite cover as well. And it makes for kind of a really fun color. I don't know how else to describe it besides just fun. It's kind of like like a brassy silver almost. It's not quite like a blue electrum you get sometimes when you mix silver and gold in other paint manufacturers. This one's almost like a tarnished gold, like really heavily tarnished, such that most of the shine of the gold is taken out. And it may not look like it now, but once I put the silver on next to it, you should be able to see it. You definitely can on the model itself. So just getting all his metal pieces. He's got the chest plate, 2 shoulder plates, the 2 knee plates, the 2 thigh plates, And his belt buckle. There goes the silver. Getting the edges of the goggles. Then decided I'd try a new technique, one I haven't tried yet, for painting lenses, where I actually use a transparent paint that I recently picked up, instead of just painting the blues. But we'll get to that when we get to that. Now just hitting the zipper, or the buckles, or whatever they may be, as well as his side buckles. Very busy sculpt. Lots going on. So now I'm going to start poorly lining the armor. Not going as slow as I should. So you should be able to see the differences now. The middle of the knee pad kind of looks very grungy, where the outside is kind of really bright. It was hard to see on the thigh pads. Even when I was painting them myself, I had trouble. Couldn't really pick out where I'd already done. So then just decided I'd do it all in silver so I could get the inner parts, and then just repaint the kind of the muddy metallic after I was finished. Here I'm kind of touching up some of those pieces, but this gold paint, while it goes on really well, it separates super quick. So unfortunately, too much time had passed. I had to try and remix it, and I don't know if I really got it revitalized enough back to the true potency, but I gave it my best shot. I didn't quite want to mix another, because I didn't know my ratio from the first time. I just kind of free-handed it. Getting the buttons on the bandolier and the little clasps there. So now I'm going to work on some shades. Just getting some shades on everything, pretty much, to help pick it out. I usually paint with shades. I really like how they look, what they do for my painting. I don't stop at shades usually, even though sometimes the miniature just looks fantastic to me. So right now I'm thinning it. Usually with these Games Workshop washes, I take them, if I want the color to be really pronounced, I take them straight from the bottle. Otherwise I usually thin them 1-to-1 with just my, my thinning medium. And I'm laying this on thick, because it is green, it's Biel tan green, going on a dark green already. So it needs to go on kind of thicker, but I don't want it to go straight from the bottle, for risk of it bleeding onto anywhere and just turning everything super green. So I'll actually end up doing, I think, 2 coats of wash of the Biel tan. So that everything gets green enough for my standards. Get it nice and green, just the way I like it. Once again, I commend the sculptor. Just looking at the back of the model, all of those, like the weave lines, or we'll say like the folds in the fabric, from how he's got his arm position, it looks really good. It looks very natural. Very well done. I'd love to meet the sculptor in person, be able to offer my thanks to them for being able to provide me with such a great miniature to paint. I mean, I guess I technically did thank them. I bought the model, right? So now I'm doing a Reikland Flesh Shade wash 1-to-1. It's super thinned out, and because I went with really pale skin on this particular guy, it is super thin. Normally I don't thin this one, but usually that's just if they have tanner skin. I always kind of try and pull the wash out of the eyes, because they don't need to be any darker. Noticed I kind of have some weird pooling going on at the neck there. Not too happy with that. Figured since I already had this wash made, I'd just hit it with the red too, instead of pulling out the Carrobug crimson. I mean, the Biel tan, or the flesh shade has got some red to it and some orange and a little bit of brown. So next up is just once again another coat of brown, just patching places, filling any gaps in the coverage I see. I went a little over on some metallics, also touching up the hair. I usually have to do hair 2 or 3 times because it tends to rub off really easy because of the texture of hair, just when you're like moving around. But that's okay, because it's super easy to cover. Doing the eyebrows again, making sure they look good, looking fine. Now I am thinning out some Agrax Earth Shade to do the tan parts, or the brown parts I should say. So his pants, and his hair. So I decided I didn't like how the thinned wash looked in the hair. I wanted a more dramatic transition. So I actually did the thin, pulled out, and then went back with the straight from the bottle once that had dried, because it wasn't pronounced enough for me. I like my hair to have very dramatic differences in it, kind of like very dramatic highlights, if you will. So here we're going back with straight from the bottle, I believe. Trying to clean up a little bit because we got that weird pooling at the side of his neck. And now it looked like to me like his sideburn had gotten hit with flesh. I'm not sure when I might have done that. So I just wanted to redo it to make sure that it kind of had the same color look as the rest. Kind of darkening the eyebrows a little bit with the wash, just so the hair tone is very similar. So now we're trying out this clear blue paint from the Tamiya line. I was just testing on my thumbnail to see how it works, kind of how the concentration works out. Stuff's really kind of thick. It's kind of like the Blood for the Blood God technical paint. It gets like that. It doesn't start out that thick, but it's very similar. In fact, that's probably why people use the clear red as blood effects. I personally think you can't do any better than Blood for the Blood God. It's the best one I've found, but it's my personal preference. So now I'm hitting all the armor with Nuln oil. Nuln oil straight out of the bottle. I always like to hit my metallics that way, because honestly, they're not going to miss out too much on the extra color, and it just gives them more character. So I will almost always give my metallics straight from the bottle hit of the whatever wash I'm using. Sometimes it's well, in fact, sometimes I do a bunch of different colors. I've painted it with Biel tan before, or Drakenhof Nightshade, or Carrobug Crimson, kind of whatever color I'm doing the metallics. I like to usually hit them pretty hard with the washes. It gives them character without dramatically altering their color. So like those knee pads, it really dramatically outlined them because it filled that crevice between the two sections, as well as kind of made them look nice and dirty. Star Wars is not a clean, fancy universe. It is not the universe of the prequels. It is the universe of the original trilogy. Dark, dangerous, violent. That is Star Wars. So whenever I paint Star Wars models, I want to have that feel because that's the universe I feel Star Wars should be. So now I've gone and mixed up some gray so that I can do the highlights in the black sections. I usually do a multi-tone step up from black. So I paint the black first as kind of the shadow, and then highlight up from some grays, and then wash it with black to bring it all back in line. I really like that method. It seems to serve me very well. It ends up looking really nice, kind of gives it a nice sheen without kind of tons of work. I'm working on a new kind of highlighting lately where you do more dramatic highlights than you feel are natural, and then wash them back into line, and they end up looking really nice. You tend to take those normal steps that you feel are right, because that's what feels right on like a large scale, a macro scale. But when that translates into the micro, you end up doing a whole lot of work without much payoff. So I'm not saying that's a bad way to paint. When I'm doing like my super studio quality stuff, I paint like that. I paint just varying shades of ultra thin paint. It ends up looking really nice. But if I'm not doing like a studio type paint job, just something like this that's just quick and nice, I tend to do the more dramatic approach because it provides a real cool looking transition without kind of all the work. And with mini painting, with as much work as you can cut out and still make it look good, you definitely should, because there's a lot of work to do. So I actually, these boots went a little lighter than I like, even with my dramatic transitions. I tried to darken them up, but they still ended up a little light. They're kind of more like a darker suede now instead of like a black leather I was going for. So now I'm doing the same approach on the gloves, trying to use the same paint I mixed. I should have just done it at the same time I was doing the boots, so the transitions would have been exactly the same, but I completely forgot there were other black parts. That tends to happen to me a lot. I get this tunnel vision going on with the models, and I forget to look for other similar like colors. I ended up actually stepping up too quickly on the gloves. I didn't like it. It was too dramatic. Because once I hit that, what is like basically the bright highlight on the boots, you know, I had to go one more up. And then it was way too bright. It was like, you know, bright gray. So I hit him with that dark black and figured I'd start over again. Just doing a quick dirty highlight on the chest there, on the goggles. Now I am manually highlighting the hair. Sometimes this is easily done with just a dry brush. But since the hair was so well defined, once again, my thanks to the sculptor, my compliments to the sculptor, I decided I'd just do it with the brush. You know, I got a small brush, it's really easy. Just picked out individual hairs and went over them with the base coat color as like a first highlight. So now I'm going straight from the bottle with Nuln oil to kind of bring the shading on the boots back into line. Since it was so bright, I kind of lobbed it on nice and thick to try and step that color down as much as I could. Same on the gloves. The model owner wanted black gloves and black boots, so I, figured I'd do my best to try and get them back as close to that color as I could. Which it still looks really good. I mean, it's just shiny black as opposed to more matte black, which honestly is probably only worrisome to the painter themselves, not any consumer. So now I'm just painting the pants, going over with highlights. I'm actually using the base coat color. That's what I normally do for my first highlight. Picking out the raised edges, the things light would catch. Once again, lots of spots on this model. It's very well sculpted. If you're always looking at your models from, say, 3 or 4 inches away, like we are right now from the webcam, then you're going to notice those things. But most people only view the model from 2 or 3 feet, or maybe 5 or 6 inches when they decide to pick it up and look closely. And so you can get away with some more dramatic highlights like that. If anything, it catches the eye and makes it look really good. So now I've added a little bit of a lighter tan and are doing a more edge-based highlight. Kind of just the extreme edges on his pants. And now I am preparing some paint. Yes, some dry brushing. So I wanted to give the gun a little bit of a metallic hit. You know, a lot of guns in Star Wars are always just straight matte black, and I like them to be somewhat metallic, so I just did a dry brush of the darkest silver I had, which is a gunmetal. I did kind of a liberal dry brush, napkin or paper towel, whatever I'm using, and then tested on my fingers first to see what kind of pattern it's laying down. So now I am putting in some silver for the optics, followed by the, looks like a wash on the fingers. Got ahead of myself, because I realized I missed them when I did the wash on his face. So now that the silver's dry, going back to that clear blue, and we've got our front up optic, or a back optic and a front optic. Little lenses. Super easy. I'll tell you though, that Tamiya stuff, that is very potent. Just breathing around it. I think it's an alcohol suspension, as opposed to most miniature paints, which are suspended in some kind of acrylic medium. And it's very strong. Definitely don't sit around huffing that, because it'll do bad things to your brain, I'm sure. So I found this little insignia on his chest I missed when I was doing the metallics earlier. So I did the bottom parts with the silver, and the top parts I did with a brass I have that I really like. And whenever I do my brasses, I always follow them up with, straight from the bottle, Sepia wash. It just makes the brasses look very aged. Doing some sepia on the leather too, because I forgot to highlight those. Or excuse me, I forgot to wash those. So just making sure everything's got a little bit of wash on it. Just hitting this oddly placed leather strap. Maybe it's part of a flight suit. I mean, maybe when they're in the cockpit, they unbuckle it and go between the legs to buckle in all the way. I don't know. So when they're not in the cockpit, they don't like a strap right up against their junk, so they move to the side. Anyway, we're on to white. White is my least favorite color to paint, because I have never painted easy white that wasn't just coming out of a rattle can or an airbrush. It never goes easy. It always messes all sorts of stuff up. See, I'm pulling paint off right there. It never covers well. I thin this because it's a catch-22 with white paint. Either you thin it and you do just tons of coats, or you don't thin it and you risk it going chalky on you. Because white will dry into pigments very quickly, and then it just gets chalky and it looks terrible. I try and paint white as infrequently as possible, to tell you the honest truth. If I can do something else, even if it's an off-white, I've got a leather white paint I use often for an off-white that I probably should have just used here, that is kind of more gray, that looks really good with just half the effort. But this is pure white. And naturally there will be more coats coming up from a brown to a white. That's to be expected. But it's worth it. You know, you put in the time in the back end, and when you're done, it looks a lot better. So hitting all these straps, kind of like, I saw these as being on the back portion here, it's more white bleed, as like, you know that like weave cloth that backpack straps are made out of? For some reason, I just saw that as the back straps, and then it's got this white trim too. So just doing lots of coats of white, building up the color. And now that I've got the color built up, I found a little hair hanging off the back of the gun. I'm sure you can probably see it. I couldn't get it with the tweezers. I should probably clean my tweezers off. They're probably gunked up with super glue. So now I am just doing the green highlights. Just kind of save the best for last. So going over all the parts in the coat that would stand out with the green base color. There's a lot of parts that are standing out on this here coat. There's a lot of parts to this here coat. Just doing several coats of highlights since this color builds up slow. And I thinned it a little bit. I like to do that on my highlights so that I can do multiple coats of highlights and they blend a little bit better. So now I'm doing a little bit of an edge highlight on the upper edge of that leather, just using the base coat. Just on that goofy leg strap, or crotch strap, whatever it may be. Mixed a little bit of yellow in to kind of brighten the green, so that it would have kind of a more dramatic highlight. See, I'm just kind of doing the edges there, as opposed to the whole piece, so that it builds kind of a more, or a less uniform color, a more broken up one. Apparently I got the back of his head at some point when I was doing green highlights. Not really sure when that happened. So I'm tidying that up, and I'll hit that again with a little bit of brown wash to bring the color back in line. Just doing another last coat on the white, kind of like a final coat, last hurrah. Get it as bright as I can before I dirty it up. And now we're using that thinned Agrax Earth shade from before. And I wanted to dirty this with the Agrax instead of the Nuln oil. Since it has that brown undercoat, I figured it would look a lot more natural. It would kind of stick to the same color palette, which in this model is very earth tony with kind of a red highlight. So I wanted to still look the same without being... I don't know, it's hard to describe. It's like color science. It looks more appeasing on the eye because it's more natural. Just doing another wash on the hair. That was after highlighting, and to also make sure we got the back covered, kind of in this ducktail area. And now while I'm waiting for wash to dry, just doing the base. I've just been doing these Imperial Assault miniatures with just a straight black base. Normally with my the models I paint, I do extravagant bases, but where these, after we finish with them for our Star Wars campaign, will be used for a board game, as opposed to like a tabletop miniature game, I wanted them to be still like legal play pieces. So just that one lovely game, you know, hurry up and wait, watch them paint dry. Doing another wash on the fingers. I think at this point I realized I haven't highlighted the face yet. So I decided I'd do some highlights on the face, kind of pick out his jawline, and kind of his cheekbones, and his lips, and wouldn't you know it, I kind of just ended up changing his color tone. But I kept the shadows where they needed to be, so that's what's most important. Kind of doing the same highlights now with a second coat. Bringing old Remy's face up. Realized now that I had changed his skin tone and his fingers were too dark, so I had to go and hit them with the skin tone as well. So that he didn't look like he was kind of a Frankenstein monster put together from different people. I kind of messed up that eyebrow too when I hit that temple area, so I had to go back and redo that. So like I said earlier, 80% of miniature painting is just covering up your old mistakes. Just doing another coat of paint on the black. When I do the bases like this, I tend to do them quick and it leaves brush strokes, so 2 coats makes those go away. So at this point, we're just about done with the model. Cleaning up a few spots I saw on the gun. Kind of had some weird color going on. I accidentally hit the pinky with the black paint, so went and had to fix that. Ended up getting to that point where you start making making 2 mistakes when you try to fix one, and so on and so forth. So I decided it was probably time to call it. The miniature looks good. I'm pretty proud of it. Just got some more touch-ups to do on that base from the black. But all in all, a really nice looking model. So yeah, if you have any questions or comments, feel free to leave them below, and I will get to them. If you have any questions about any techniques I used or anything like that, just let us know in the comments section so that we can make a video about it. I'll do a little tutorial. Otherwise, feel free to give us a subscribe if you liked what you saw, and we'll see you next time when we paint our next model.